Well, welcome and good evening, everyone. My name is Stephen Barter, and I have the privilege to be the co-chair of the Chicago Booth Global Advisory Board within the EMEA region. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the Chicago Booth London campus tonight. We have a packed room here of over 300 Chicago Booth students, alumni, and friends. And we're also joined by a global audience via our Facebook live stream. So welcome to London. The reason is, of course, the enormous interest in our guest speaker, Professor Raghuram Rajan, who has so kindly agreed to join us once again, this time for an intimate conversation amongst a global audience about the headwinds to growth with our other eminent guest, Martin Wolf of the Financial Times. Now, if you'd like to tweet about the conversation, you're very welcome to, and please use the hashtag #BoothInsights, all one word. But first, for our new visitors, let me briefly say something about the school. Chicago Booth is part of the University of Chicago, a private research-based university with over 15,000 students, funded by John D. Rockefeller in 1890. Now, in a crowded business school world, Chicago Booth stands out for its insight, influence, and impact on questions of global importance. We're all reminded of that impact every time we walk past the photos of the school's 90 Nobel laureates displayed just outside the room here. 9 of those Nobel Prizes have been awarded to Chicago Booth faculty for their work in economic sciences. We were the first business school anywhere in the world to have a Nobel laureate within the faculty. Last year was no exception when our own Professor Richard Thaler was awarded the 2017 Nobel Prize for his work in behavioral economics. Professor Thaler, well known for his book Nudge, was very influential in the establishment of the Behavioral Insights team within the UK's Cabinet Office. And today, some 300 nudge units are influencing public policy around the world. It's amazing what a difference Chicago and London can make together. Professor Thaler still regularly teaches here at our campus in London, which has been our home in Europe since 2005. Each year, over 300 executives from over Europe, elsewhere in the world, come here to take our executive MBA, joining others enrolled in our non-degree and exec ed programs, all taught by our renowned Chicago faculty. And this year, we celebrate the 75th anniversary of our executive MBA program, which was the first of its kind anywhere in the world back in 1943. Now to our subject for tonight, headwinds to growth, and to our special guests. Now, we would all agree that these are particularly volatile times when the familiar model of Western capitalism and the role played by the financial sector and by governments in delivering growth is being challenged. If I needed to pick some scene setters for our discussion, 2 new books offer well-timed commentaries on these themes. One by Sir Paul Tucker, a former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, ponders to whom central bankers are really accountable and how their unelected economic influence has expanded. The other, The Value of Everything by Mariana Mazzucato, which Martin Wolf himself reviewed in the FT a couple of weeks ago, challenges the relationship between markets and governments and asks who creates value, who extracts value, and who destroys value, and examines the consequences of mistaking the one for the other. Now, Professor Raghuram Rajan is one of Chicago Booth's most renowned, long-serving faculty members. Between 2013 and 2016, he served as the 23rd Governor of the Reserve Bank of India and was recognized as the man responsible for ushering in a new era of fiscal responsibility, which transformed India into the fastest-growing major economy in the world. Considered by some as one of the best central bankers worldwide and one of the few economists to predict the financial crisis, He was also described as India's inflation warrior. It's clear that Professor Rajan has won many admirers among his peers, and in 2014 he was named Central Banker of the Year. Before his time at the Reserve Bank, Professor Rajan was the Chief Economic Advisor in India's Ministry of Finance, and he was the youngest ever Chief Economist at the International Monetary Fund. A love of teaching brought him to Chicago Booth in 1991, where he's now the Catherine Dusac Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance. That's quite a long envelope. His passion for research-based thinking has won him many awards, among them the American Finance Association inaugural Fisher-Black Prize in 2003 for the most significant contribution to the theory and practice of finance by someone still under the age of 40. And in 2010, he was awarded the Financial Times Goldman Sachs Best Business Book Prize for his book, Fault Lines: How Hidden Fractures Still Threaten the World Economy. And they still do. He has just written another book, I Do What I Do, a collection of speeches and commentary from his time as the Reserve Bank of India governor. So, as a renowned scholar, respected economist, and one of the world's foremost thinkers on the relationship between finance, capitalism, and democracy, we all wait with great interest to see what the future might have in store for him. Now, we are so fortunate this evening to have as our moderator Martin Wolf. As many of you know, Martin is Associate Editor and Chief Economics Commentator of the Financial Times. An accomplished journalist, Martin was awarded the CBE in 2000 for services to financial journalism. He's won numerous prizes, including the Ludwig Erhard Prize in 2009 for economic commentary, and in the same year, Commentariat of the Year at the Editorial Intelligence Comment Awards. He's been regularly highly placed in Foreign Policy's list of the top 100 global thinkers, and in 2013 won the Overseas Press Club of America Prize for the best commentary on international news in any medium. His most recent publications include Why Globalization Works, Fixing Global Finance, and The Shifts and the Shocks, What We've Learned and Have Still to Learn from the Financial Crisis, which may well come up this evening. So I would ask you all to join me in giving a very warm welcome to Martin Wolf as he faces down the headwinds to growth with Professor Raghu Rajan.
Well, thank you. That was certainly a very generous introduction. Let's hope we can live up to it. We're sitting in astonishingly deep and comfortable chairs. The only real risk at this point of the day is that I'll fall asleep. The way we're going to do this, about 25 minutes of discussion. If it's incredibly fascinating, it could be 30. Then there'll be questions from you. I think you should be thinking about your questions. I have simple rules about a question. I know the difference between a statement and a question, believe it or not. And I will stop you if it isn't a question. Questions can always be completed in one sentence. I promise you it is possible. I will take several at a time, so please obey these rules so that we can have many people as possible asking Raghu questions. Let me start with one of the issues that has already been raised in that very generous introduction, which is the financial system. You are very justly famous for your speech, lecture at the conference in honor of Alan Greenspan before the crisis, in which you warned the assembled dignitaries of the economics profession that there were very serious risks in the financial system. I think your remarks did not receive unanimous approval, and I know well some of the people who didn't approve. So when you look now at what has happened to the global financial system, particularly the Western financial system, where we are in terms of leverage in the system, transparency, debt overall, should we feel comfortable that these risks are now managed and contained? Or should we be worried actually that the sorts of things you were worried about then are still very relevant if you look at the global system as a whole?
Well, first, thanks for having me here. Thanks for agreeing to do this, Martin. And I think the reality is that we have made progress since the financial crisis, at least in the way we regulate banks. We've required a lot more capital than they had at that time. I would say that a number of activities they undertook, they're at least being a little more careful about them. Of course, the memory of those days still lies with some of the senior people in the banks, which makes them a little more circumspect. So, to my mind, the banks this time around aren't the center of the problem. Of course, if the banks have shed risk and become more circumspect, you have to ask, where has risk gone? Because the risk hasn't actually fallen, it's just got transported somewhere else. And there, I think, we have done much less work on the shadow financial system, the non-bank financial system, that has absorbed some of the risk, that has absorbed some of the aggressive traders who were in the banks and were let go. And the question is, are they able to manage it if there's a problem? And then the question is, should there be a problem? Well, certainly since the financial crisis, we've had very accommodative monetary policy. Loads of liquidity, as well as a promise from the central banks implicit, an implicit promise that if things go bad, we will come in and help. And that promise had to be made because in an environment of very weak growth, you didn't want wealth effects to knock the real economy back into recession. Based on those promises, we've had an extensive levering up of both the corporate sector as well as not the household sector as much in the US, for example, but in some other countries, for example, Australia and Canada, we've had a levering up of the household sector.
And also emerging economies, non-financial corporates quite significantly in emerging economies.
Absolutely. So we've had easy monetary policy, easy liquidity, and the consequence of that has been more leverage. That leverage has come to depend on easy conditions. And the question is, as the easy conditions sort of start disappearing, do those corporations, do the entities that have borrowed have enough sort of slack to manage? And that's the big question. We don't know. We know there are pockets of leverage. We know already Argentina, for example, is facing difficulty as interest rates have started moving up, as the dollar has strengthened. There will be more places where we will see difficulty. For example, I mean, this is a well-known fact, covenant-light loans are 3 or 4 times what they were pre-financial crisis. That's suggesting that we haven't sort of toned down leverage.
Now, there is, of course, an argument that the optimistic argument would be that now a lot of this leverage is in the form of bonds.
Yeah.
They're held essentially via bond funds of various kinds. A huge rise in the role of asset managers, which is slightly different from the shadow banking, actually significantly of the shadow banking before the crisis. And these channels are relatively disconnected from the banking system. Right. So you might have a situation, okay, and they're ultimately owned by households and funds of various pension funds and so forth. So Argentina default. Other countries, I don't want to name countries, defaults. There are corporations that default. They go through bankruptcy, or in the corporate government countries, it's always a bit messier. But ultimately, okay, they're real money owners. It's passed through by the asset managers. There's no leverage there. It's a sort of structure that should work. Bankruptcy has to happen in a capitalist system, and the banking industry will survive. Is that far too optimistic? And you must have heard this, or is it actually a reasonably accurate picture as you see it?
You were talking about statements versus questions.
Doesn't apply to me.
That was a great No, that was a great statement, and I think you're absolutely right that it is possible that more of the bonds are held by passive institutions that can absorb the losses. Yes, you have a bigger hole in your pension fund, but it doesn't result in a pension fund run. The problem, however, is all these entities are feeding into the same market. So yes, a fair number of it may be passive institutions, but there could be more active, leveraged institutions also feeding into the same market. And to the extent that we have crowded positions in these markets that some of these entities are trying to get out of, you could have a substantial fall and more entities could be drawn in. In a sense, if you remember, and you obviously do, when Ben Bernanke was talking about the subprime crisis, he said it's 100 billion in, at that time, a 12 trillion economy. This is small in the scheme of things. But what is small if it's not clear where it sort of lies and who bears those risks can infect the whole system. And then you have to sort of clean up the whole system, or at least do the stress tests, etc., that tell you, in fact, the system is relatively immune from these problems. So I certainly agree that this could be in better places. I don't think we can be confident that it is. And if it's not, it could spread more widely. Now, that said, I do want to sort of move away from my position as a Cassandra. I'm not saying we're in a bad position right now. And to some extent, the title of the talk seems to suggest, these are terrible days. Let us at least be thankful. For the first time since the financial crisis, we've had 1 year of good growth, 2017, and 2018 looks like it might be similar, so long as nothing really bad happens.
So then I'd love to go further, but let's go from, actually there's one little question. Do you think instead of stress testing the banks, we should be stress testing the economies? That's what seems to be the implication of what you're saying.
But what would you do once you stress tested the economy? At the IMF, we did all these early warning exercises, trying to figure out where the problems were. But there are always problems in an economy, always things that could go wrong. The question is, what can you do once you... So if you think the housing sector is heating up, you can do some macroprudential measures. May or may not be enough. If they're not enough, do you ramp it up?
Well, you could, for example, though this would be more structural than temporary, you could decide to push really, really hard for changing the tax treatment of interest.
You could.
That could make a lot of sense as a fundamental reform. It's not something that is pushed very hard, for instance, by the fund.
Yeah, you could do it. You would do it for a variety of other reasons, but you could do it also seeing the movement upwards in leverage. It is something you could.
Now let's go to the central banks. You were a very distinguished central banker, also very critical in that role of the Western central banks for the monetary policies they were pursuing. I'd be interested in your views. I presume you haven't changed those views, and they're linked to the leverage. So rather than going back through the economic history, though, unless you want to comment on it, I'd be interested in whether you think they should be tightening much faster than they are. No. At the moment, obviously, the US is tightening in a measured way. The US is very strong. Elsewhere, not so much. But the economies are strengthening. Have they lost the plot?
No. Look, my main criticism was that while I believe the central banks did exactly the right thing immediately after the crisis, rescuing the system was absolutely important. And the various programs which were rolled out to rescue the system, I think if they hadn't done that, we'd have had the Great Depression Mark II. So I think they were exactly right. And I think QE1, for example, in the US, was essentially aimed at rescuing a market for mortgage-backed securities, which, if it hadn't happened, could have led to greater problems in the system. Similarly, I think the ECB's attempt to rescue sovereign bonds, which was successful, was also important because that could again have had widespread.
It was a serious panic.
It's a serious panic. So I have no problem with central banks moving in these big rescues. There are issues of moral hazard, but I think you can't really worry about it at that point. The problem is what happens after that. And there I feel that to some extent, the central banks have been trapped by their mandate, by the inflation mandate. And we have a lot of knowledge and experience about bringing inflation down below the upper bound, much less success in bringing inflation up once it's pierced the lower bound. And so there, I think we've spent a lot of time on these very interesting new unconventional monetary policies. But my sense is if you look back at them and see what their effect was, it would be very hard to make the link from there to interest rates. You can have, I think there's some ability to make that link, but then from interest rates to the real economy, much harder. And so the question is, should we have gone there? I think we'll debate it for a long time. I was under the impression that the central banks had pretty much done what they could do at that point and should have let other elements take over. And the debate we've had is, were there any other elements to take over at that point?
What point do you think that, so let's get this more clear in terms of timing. At what point do you think it is after all, the Eurozone still faced a very big crisis in 2012 up into 2013. And though the US was recovering, there was still a fair amount of unemployment at that rate. So what point do you think they really, I mean, this is very brief, but because of the more interesting issue about now, but where do you think they really should have changed?
So these policies are connected, and that's part of the problem, right? So my sense is the ECB, and I'm talking, I'm not claiming to have personal knowledge. I don't want to claim inside knowledge. My sense is the ECB was not really convinced about QE and didn't think it was a particularly great policy. But given that the US had moved fully into it, given that Japan was moving into it, there's tremendous pressure. You guys aren't meeting your inflation mandate. You have to do something. And they moved into it. It's not clear to me. It may be that QE in Europe had some effects. But it seems to me they were pushed into it. And to some extent, it was a response to the policies of other central banks. The main channel of transmission was through a depreciated euro rather than through real activity. So what this has transformed into, to some extent, they will never say this is the central purpose, but I think at the back of the mind is that it keeps our currency competitive and gives us a chance in growing. Now, that can't be, for central banks, the primary way of transmission. If that is, then you're probably going a little too far.
If they hadn't done these things and we'd had inflation falling to zero or to deflation,
well,
would that have worried you?
So it's hard to know what would have happened, right?
Of course.
Whether, in fact, we would have had deflation or whether low inflation would have persisted. I mean, to some extent, the analogy is with the common cold, right? We feed it all these medicines, and then, a week later we get well. Now, is it because the body naturally recovered, or you gave it all this medicine? I think we need to look into the channels of transmission. There'll be a lot of research done on QE for a long, long time. But my basic concern was we were sort of using instruments which probably had much more effect on financial risk-taking and distortions of prices in the financial system rather than on real activity. And to some extent, so long as they continued, it also took the pressure off politicians to do what they had to do at that point in terms of figuring out ways to restore growth. Now, I think the question that you would have, which I'm going to put in your mouth, is what could they have done? And you know, I think building more confidence in the economy through structural reforms, but of course structural reforms have an immediate, typically negative effect. Could they have done this over the 7-year, 8-year period? They could have done some more probably than they did.
Let's talk a bit about where we are now. As you say, we've got strong growth. It's global. Everybody's growing. So from an economic point of view, things look pretty good. And everybody's thinking about ending exceptional policies, and the Fed is tightening. So right at the moment, the concern about monetary policy is how to manage tightening. And of course, people are thinking about what they could do if there's another recession, but let's leave that for a moment. But the big concerns are in other areas. You have highly populist policymakers. We'll come to why that's so. You have a clear resurgence of serious protectionism with very intense and bitter bilateral discussions going on between the two biggest economies in the world, the US and China. The US has just decided, after not doing anything with fiscal policy during the crisis, to have a very substantial structural fiscal boost in a low-saving economy. And there's a sort of pretty savage attacks on international economic institutions. So how do you see the economic optimism against this sort of political disorder, which pretty obviously is itself in large part a consequence of the aftermath and existence of the crisis? How worried should, going back to Headwinds, I know you want to be optimistic, but how worried should we be about all this, which you wrote about so much in that book?
Yeah. Well, so let me just add one element to the previous answer, which is this fiscal package that the U.S. came up with just now, which, as you said, would have been much better 5 or 7 years ago. And the question is, of course, the Democrats and the Republicans were at each other's throat, and maybe it may not have passed under the previous administration. But wouldn't it have been better if it had passed then than now? And to what extent did monetary policy make things a little easier so that they didn't have to do it then? I don't know. We'll never know the answer.
I always thought that was a terrifying game of chicken, but
yeah,
I understand the argument.
The argument is that perhaps, and I agree with you, no central banker wants to play that game of chicken, and they will always respond by doing what.
It's not their mandate to terrify fiscal policymakers into loose fiscal policy, in my view. But that's a debate.
No.
Anyway,
so just to conclude on that, it's more not so much that you're terrifying them, but whether you should keep pulling rabbits out of the hat, saying here's another program which will make you feel that things are moving in the right direction, or do you throw up your hands at some point and say, you know, it's time you guys did stuff. But we can go on for a long time. No, these other issues are really worrying, right? And they're not just a consequence of the financial crisis. They've been building up for a long time. Clearly, you know, there's a sense that there is a division in industrial countries between the elite and the rest. The elite have got the goodies. The elite claimed knowledge and then took us through the financial crisis. And look, they didn't suffer, but we suffered. And unfortunately, I think the elite also have become very closely associated with the bankers. Look what happened to them. So the narrative is the populist nationalist narrative is, you know, it's us, the people, against the elite. We don't trust elite institutions. We don't trust, you know, central bankers. We need to rethink all this.
And there's also hostility to immigrants as part of this, which is clearly a very disturbing feature of the politics of many countries.
Well, it is part of this, you know, this sense of the majority in country after country that we're doing badly, not because we need to change, but it's these other guys who are benefiting. It's the minorities, it's the immigrants, it's women. It's this crowd which has been propped up by the elite because the elite sort of have the Davos sensibilities that don't really belong here, right? So there are various versions of this, but I think there are two elements that are common across. One is the people typically are not benefiting as much from economic progress and growth, whatever little there is, than others. They see people moving ahead. And second, they don't trust the establishment. And in this volatile mix, you have the politician who comes and says, I'm going to change things. And once you stop listening to the experts, you don't have to think through complicated stuff. It becomes very simple. China is making a mess of our economy by running such a large surplus. We should be buying our own stuff. We should not be buying Chinese stuff. I'm going to fix things for you. Hey, China, reduce your surplus by 100 billion this year and 100
200, yes. Now it's up to 200.
So it's 200. And, so economists look at this and say, I mean, how does this add up? How do you get China to do this? And it doesn't necessarily mean that if China does this, the US suddenly starts getting all these jobs back because exports will go from Vietnam instead of China if this actually happens. But, the complicated, more nuanced discussion gets thrown out of the window because the elite aren't trusted anymore, right? So we are for direct action. That's the kind of world we are in. And, you hope that sensible minds eventually sort of have inputs on these kinds of discussions, that the initial phrasing is really for the electorate, but then you get more sensible voices pitching in. But it doesn't necessarily seem that we will reach that better outcome because we also have leaders who have to look strong, who across the world. And strong leaders typically don't have too much room for maneuver because they don't want to look weak. And if you've got two strong leaders going head to head, doesn't allow for too much dialogue if they get into entrenched positions.
Compromise is weakness.
Compromise is weakness.
So we have very little time. I'd love to go on with that. But I'd like to, the final set of questions, just to talk very briefly about India. Since you were a very distinguished governor of the Reserve Bank of India, you took over when there was quite a bit of a crisis, which you managed very well. But you've been out of it now for 2 years? So how do you see the Indian economy today in its economic performance and potential? General mood outside is great, fastest growing big economy in the world, growth 7 or 8% forever. Is that at all plausible?
Well, look, I think we have to be very careful about beating our chest with the 7% growth because we're also one of the poorest large economies in the world, and poor economies grow fast. I mean, that's if they do things right. We shouldn't sneer at the 7%, which is, the last 25 years, India has grown at 7%, except, for the fact that China has grown significantly faster. This would be one of the big sort of positive stories of our time. India's finally at the GDP level of the United Kingdom. So India has done well. Could it do better? That's the question. And I think it could, even within the constraints of a democracy. In fact, in the early stages of growth, one might argue that an authoritarian regime, well-intentioned, and that's a very big if, whether you get that, is better at creating growth because growth is all about building stuff out. It's catch-up growth. It's growth where you know the way. And it's just getting everything together, making the trains run on time, acquiring the land. It involves a certain amount of roughshod tactics. Those don't fly very well in a democracy. And so one could argue that India has been held back a little by
Certainly
its,
compared to China.
certainly, because we can't acquire land
Right.
by just saying this is land for the railroad. You
The
guys
Chinese
escape
government
tomorrow.
can just turn up and build everything.
Exactly. So we can't do that. At the same time, I think we may be reasonably positioned for the next level when we get there, which is when you go into thinking knowledge industries, frontier industries. India, with its democracy, with its culture of dialogue, of debate, could be better positioned at that point. But we got to get there. And to get there, I think we need 10 to 15 years of a real strong focus on building out infrastructure, on building human capital. Our human capital levels are much lower than we need for the growth that lies ahead. These are things we need to focus on. There are impediments. Land acquisition, for example, very difficult in India. And as a result, we don't build the highways, the airports, the railway systems that we absolutely need for the manufacturing infrastructure, for the manufacturing to take off, and so on. But if we can do a few things right, we can do that even within a democracy. And we may have a 1% slower rate than China, but that would mean 9-10%. So I think we can do it, but we need a very strong focus on implementation, and that I think
That is what Mr. Modi's supporters would claim he does. Do you doubt that?
Well, my sense is over the last 4 years, we've had a few setbacks which have slowed down the growth relative to what it could be, but we also haven't had that single-minded focus on the big projects, the infrastructure build-out, etc. Early on in the Modi administration, there was talk of reforming the land acquisition bill. That hasn't happened, which means land acquisition is still as difficult, which means some of these mega projects that were being talked about, such as the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, which would have been Chinese-style projects with Chinese-style logistics available to manufacturing and so on. You don't hear that much talk about it anymore, which suggests that the pace hasn't been as much as the government desires. We need to revamp that, and I think that will imply taking a look at land acquisition legislation and so on.
With great regret, I'm going to allow you to ask questions because I've only just started. So I'll take 3 at a time. Would you stand up, say who you are, and ask the question? Go ahead.
Does it work? Salka Sadio, alum. Thanks for taking my question. I'll be brief. Basically, almost 10 years since the financial crisis in Europe, rates are still close to zero, if not negative. Just interested to have your view if you think that we are stuck in a sort of a Japanese scenario, low growth, low inflation, rates close to zero, or there's a chance we might normalize monetary condition if we can afford to do so.
Okay. Any more? This gentleman here.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening, sir. Pranay Sureka, current student. I would like to know your views about the current bankruptcy law that has been introduced in India and the NCLT formations. So do you think that this is going to be a very a new era for all those problems that the banks are having, or it's going to create a problem again?
I'd like to take a woman if I could.
Good evening. My name is Nandini and I work with asset management. So do you think that the rise of passive investments poses a risk to markets and by extension economies?
Okay.
Okay.
3 good questions. Start. Is Europe becoming Japan?
Look,
Eurozone, I should say.
It's interesting. 15 years ago, we would have killed for low inflation, low interest rates, right? It would have been a wonderful environment. Now, of course, we're very unhappy, partly because there are loads of debt around and we worry about debt deflation becoming a big issue. And we also worry that the low inflation signals very low growth and so on, right? Look, I think in Europe at this point, we've had, over the last year and a half, of course, the first quarter was very slow, but we've had some recovery. The banks are now more eager to lend. You've seen growth, at least at the core, quite strong. And I think that at this point, Europe is sort of back to growing at potential. Of course, potential is not very high. Not very high for two reasons, or two or three reasons. One, productivity is still very modest, as it is across the world. Second, aging labor forces, so the growth in the labor force is not very strong. And third, the usual sort of impediments to doing business, etc., the protections in the service area and so on. So which of these can you change? You don't quite know how to increase productivity. That's something that happens. You can make investments. Beyond that, we don't know how to increase. We certainly don't know how to increase total factor productivity. On aging, you can't reverse aging. You can have people have more babies. That's not proven very successful across the world. And wealth is one of the strongest contraceptives that we know. And so to that extent, it's hard to reverse that. You can get more immigration, but of course that has its own issues associated. And the third is structural reforms to make economies more competitive. Now, on that front, it may well be that Europe is ahead of the United States in terms of having a more competitive, certainly industrial sector, maybe not the service sector. But I think there's more work that could be done there. If one can do all that, you're growing pretty much at the rate that is possible. That's all you can hope for.
And I won't go into the monetary policy implications. The bankruptcy law of India, is this potentially transformative?
Well, there was a time not so long ago when the Indian entrepreneur basically believed that the loan from the bank didn't necessarily have to be repaid, right? And I think that that put the banks in a very difficult position. That essentially, I think, had to be rectified. I think the bankruptcy code, for the first time, gives borrowers a sense that they may actually lose their business. Now, it's still being worked out. We have almost the first few coming out at the other side, and interestingly, they're coming out without the original entrepreneur, which I think is an important signal that people can actually lose their businesses. And some, in fact, are waking up now and saying, please don't take me through bankruptcy code, I'll pay, which is, I think, a very good development. However, you cannot take every company through the bankruptcy code. There are too many companies in distress for the bankruptcy code to be the solution. There are not enough judges, there are not enough courts. They will get clogged up very quickly. And if a borrower knows that the court judgment will come 10 years from now, then it's back to having no penalty whatsoever. So I think that a bankruptcy court has to work with an out-of-court bankruptcy system which is effective, where you do the deals out of court and then move it in, have the bankruptcy court as a kind of shadow. If you don't agree here, we go into that, but otherwise we agree a lot outside. The problem then there is that the banks themselves need to be willing to do the deals. Okay, you can't pay 100%, but I know you can pay 80. I'm going to do a deal at 80. In India today, the public sector banks don't really have the confidence to do these deals and expect they won't be hauled up by the investigative agencies. This is what is clogging up the system outside of bankruptcy. And if you don't rectify this, cleaning up the banking system will take much longer. The bankers have to have a sense that they will be protected if they make reasonable judgments on how much haircuts they can take. in a sense, we need the out-of-court resolution also. It can't all be decided by the bankruptcy court. And that needs reforms again.
The last question, which I thought was really interesting, we have had this marked shift to passive investment. It's cheap, the costs are low, and there's lots of evidence, of course, that active management, on average, doesn't beat the market. So why not? But what effects does this have on the functioning of markets, and particularly, essentially, trend magnifying in markets, which comes back to our discussion at the beginning?
I mean, you said it, right? That if you don't have individual entities actively searching out information, choosing strategies, trying to make money on their own, and instead you have indexers monopolizing the market or dominating the market, indexers who basically buy based on shares that they have of each stock that they have to own, rather than on this stock is better than the other. The information acquisition in the market falls. And of course, the entities that are in the index get money regardless, or their stock gets bought regardless, and you don't have the kind of penalizing. If somebody does badly, you sell their stock and move off. So the market, if it gets dominated by the indexers, has too much of the trend magnification, of inadequate information, and so on. You do hope that there is a balance we reach, where you have a certain amount of trend of indexers, and a certain amount of people basically say the indexers are making big mistakes, I'm going to make money off that. And they keep the indexers honest, so to speak. But is there a theorem which says...
free riding, ultimately, isn't it? It's a sort of free riding.
Indexes are free riding
on other people's information generating processes, which is costly.
They are, but they're also leaving themselves open to be taken advantage of, because they're moving into stock regardless of quality. So if I want to sell, I think this stock is bad, I sell to an indexer, the indexer keeps the price up. So they create profit opportunities also. And I think the net of equilibrium is what we have to look at.
Okay, I'll take three more very quick. So this gentleman here at the front, stand up.
My name is Ranjit Sikka.
Okay. You can ask questions.
I have a question about the default cycle. Post-financial crisis, the central bankers and politicians have taken the sort of asset inflation as a channel to create economic growth. Along with the asset inflation has resulted in debt growth. And now we're at a stage where probably the debt levels are higher than what they were pre-financial crisis. So the question then is, if and also the unproductive firms, Bank of International Settlement saying has grown as well. The question is, can we really have a normal default cycle now? Because if a lot of population is engaged in unproductive firms, the minute you have default cycle and you have asset deflation, the economic growth falls. So Martin said that.
I understand the question. I think that's clear. So somebody at the back, right at there. Yes, okay. This is arbitrary. You all want to ask questions, but it's not possible.
Yeah. I'm
the organizer at full. It should have been 4 hours.
I'm from the steel industry, not related to economics, but I've been reading Dr. Rajan's book. You mentioned about your tenure across 2 governments, and I would like to ask how transparent or proactive is the bureaucracy in India with regards to all this, liberalization and economic policies and forward thinking.
Okay, and the last question, somebody. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Deepa. You said that India is one of the poorest and largest economies, and while it's important we keep growing, how do you suggest we do this equitably? How do you suggest we amend something like land acquisition in a way that doesn't just help big businesses, but also helps equitable growth across the country?
So 3 very, very good questions. How is the default? Can we have a normal default cycle, given that, at least in the corporate sector, not in the financial sector, in the Western world, I won't go into the rest of the world, debt is probably higher than ever before, and it bears on how high interest rates can go. That's the first question.
Well, I think that's a very good question. And this is part of the reason why I worry about the sort of rescuing the system with very easy money, right? Now, again, one has to be very careful. The answer is not an Andrew Mellon kind of liquidate. You can't liquidate the system. But have we allowed some of these zombie firms, for want of a better term, to persist and not go out at the right time. Now they held up, they have a lot of debt. Will they come down in the next cycle? But in which case we get more failures than in the normal cycle, and will that create much more unemployment? That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know to what extent we have the walking wounded still with us who haven't been cleared out by the last recession. And this is one of the distortions created by easy money over a long period of time. Of course, it has its benefits also, and that's why we have to keep weighing it. It's not a one-way street here.
There are two questions on India, and I'll put them together, and that'll be the end of the discussion, so to meet the timetable. And I always try to meet the timetable. Evaluate the quality of the Indian bureaucracy as your experience. I love that question. And how does there's lots of very poor people. In benefiting the whole population is important. Right. In distribution of income is important. How do you do the reforms while making them convincingly inclusive, to use that adjective?
So, two very good questions. Look, the bureaucracy is like the bureaucracy elsewhere. I've certainly had intimate experience of two bureaucracies, the IMF bureaucracy and the Indian bureaucracy. And, you have a whole range of people, some very energetic, committed people, as well as some people whose job is to expand their turf and very little else. So you have all kinds. I'd say in India, the real movers are actually the politicians. And good ministers in ministries can do a lot because they're more willing to take risk. They're also willing to push out of the ordinary solutions. There are always great bureaucrats who can do that, but I think great politicians in charge actually have more of an ability to do that and push things through. And so in India, good governments are always ones with good ministers, a range of good ministers. On the issue of equitable growth, for sure. And interestingly, in India, one of the reasons we tend to spend a lot in good times is precisely as one bureaucrat told me, in good times we sort of repay the poor for the sort of harm that we inflict on them in bad times, that we have, as we are a very poor country, anytime there's some surplus, we sort of pay it back. So that's part of the ethos there. But on land acquisition, for example, we have to balance out the rights of the tribals. We have to protect acquiring land from them so that they're not, in a sense, fooled by middlemen and unscrupulous entrepreneurs. But at the same time, it serves nobody if you make land acquisition so difficult that it can't be done under any circumstance except by underhand means. So you need to find a balance between protection and, to some extent, movement forward, the ability to actually do it in such a way that you enhance growth. Ultimately, that tribal may be benefited more by having a good job than by protecting that particular turf intensively. Of course, you have to respect their rights, but you have to balance these.
So thank you very much. I'm supposed to stop now. I'm not going to try and summarize, except as to make it clear to everybody here that if you're completely convinced there are no problems in the world, you're not paying attention. But problems in the world are opportunities, particularly for people in the financial sector, and I imagine many of you are. In my view, too many. So there is, one last question I have to ask which comes from, oh dear. This is quite a big question. So, how do we engage society to better understand the language of economics? You have 30 seconds. No, you have 2 minutes to answer that question.
Look, I think it's possible to explain a fair amount of economics in simple language, but it's not going to be one sentence sound bites, because the key of what economics conveys, as Martin does very well with his columns, is the direct effect is often, the least important of the effects. It's the reaction to that direct effect, the indirect effects that often overwhelm the unintended consequences, so to speak. And that's what economics contributes to policymakers. Hey, you want to press this button and you think the car will move forward. Well, you press this button, the car moves forward, but then sort of headwinds develop and start pushing it back because you're working with real people who have reactions to what you do. And so, we can explain in simple language, but, be willing to listen for more than just that first sentence, that first soundbite. Read the whole column, because in that column, Martin will explain everything. But you could have the patience to read that entire column.
I think the chances that you'll get the population of the world to read columns in the FT that are about 1,100 words is fairly small. So if that's the challenge, then I don't think we're going to succeed.
Look, that's obviously for the really interested, which I presume are people in this room. But all I'm saying is that it's possible to explain in simple language, but it really is a little more subtle than that first order effect. And that's the challenge for policymakers. How do I get the public to listen beyond that first sentence? Yes, we will attack China and get them to reduce their trade surplus, and then what?
You need politicians who actually believe that economists have something useful to say, and right at the moment they don't tend to get elected. That's a problem. Okay, thanks very, very much, and now please close it.
Well, gentlemen, you've just given us a fascinating tour d'horizon of the choppy waters and calmer seas facing us in tackling the headwinds to growth. We talked about the legacies of the financial crisis, the risks of easy money and zombie firms, and your comment that leverage has come to depend on easy conditions and what happens when things get a bit more difficult. Should central banks be tightening more, and how do they cope with weaning the patient off of QE around the world? The growth of populism in politics and protectionism, the difficulties of people, not everyone benefiting from the economic progress, and a lack of trust in our institutions and the experts. Leaders needing to look strong and compromise being presented as weakness. We touched on the Indian economy today, and we talked about being careful about pumping ourselves on the 7% growth, and reminded ourselves that India is still one of the poorest of the big economies. Could it do better? Well, yes, it could, but the constraints in growing infrastructure, land acquisition particularly, you pointed up, and I certainly know that well from my own experience. But you ultimately, we touched on the new bankruptcy laws on the way through and the importance of banks being allowed to do deals. We also reminded ourselves that too much passive investment is bad for the market. But ultimately you left us, I think, very positively by saying that growing at the rate that is possible is, given this low productivity, aging population world in which so much of us lives, is perhaps the thing that is going to reassure ministers. And we were delighted to hear you say that economics can't be taught in sound bites. I know of no better advertisement for the teaching of Chicago Booth and for reading Martin's column in the FT. So a video of tonight's presentation is going to be available. It's going to be uploaded onto the Chicago Booth YouTube site. And there'll be transcripts galore. And this has, I think, been one of our best conversations in this series so far at Chicago Booth. And once again, we thank you both so very much indeed.